Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to start our EDUCA DPS podcast for today. The topic is suicide prevention. Before we start, I want to thank our sponsors, VS America, the suppliers of flexible furniture for schools. Together, we're creating future-ready learning environments where comfort, choice, and engagement drive student success for every learning. Buckle up because we're about to start. Hello and welcome to EDUCA DPS Podcast. My name is Javier Ibarra, and today in the studio we have Dr. Jane Lineman, our Student Safety Coordinator, as part of the Department of Mental Health and Wellbeing here at Denver Public Schools. Today our topic will be a conversation about suicide prevention. Dr. Lineman, welcome back to the EDUCA studios. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
I want to ask for our audience that have been listening to us consistently over the years, how long have you worked for DPS, and what are you most proud of?
Starting to age myself.
Yeah.
Starting my 19th year with Denver Public Schools. Spent about half of that in schools and then half in central office in the role that I'm doing. Most proud of, I would say just supporting the success of our students and our families, whatever that may look like. We do it in so many different ways, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in large gestures or outcomes. But being consistent, stable, accessible, and helping to make sure that our students and our families feel successful.
So today we're going to talk about how social media can intensify feelings of isolation, comparison, and rejection, and sometimes increase the risk of suicide ideation. My first question for you is, how does exposure to harmful or triggering content on social media platforms impact individuals experiencing suicidal thoughts?
Yeah, so we know that exposure to anything that is triggering, overwhelming, significant exposure to anything that's perceived as violence can prompt feelings of anxiety, fear, depression, sadness, any of those big emotional reactions that children can have. And as a result of that, we know that overexposure to content that can prompt those feelings can further intensify those feelings and really increase the risk of an individual who potentially might be having thoughts of suicide or experiencing what we consider suicidal ideation.
So, Dr. Lineman, I want to ask, in what ways do online communities and support groups on social media serve as protective or risk factors for suicide ideation?
It's a great question. And sometimes it is based on the values that someone may have in terms of how they define the sense of connectedness or belonging. We know the number one protective factor for risk of suicide is a sense of connectedness and belonging. Having someone that you can relate to, someone who can validate how you're feeling, provide kind of a sense of comfort depending on what it is you might be experiencing. And currently, there's a lot of information out there and perceptions that online support groups can help provide that sense of connectedness. And there are times where it does so in what is perceived to be very effective. And there are opportunities where students might need a higher level of care. And so that's not necessarily meeting their need. But it all goes back to that sense of connectedness and belonging. And for a lot of our youth, being online, whether it's in a group, among friends, etc., provides them that sense of connectedness.
Well, I think back to the years of COVID and how that generation came up with that connectiveness. It seems like so far ago, but it really wasn't. And the lasting effects are still there. But I think about how we learned, we adapted to communicate, to find sense of community through online. And I wonder, do you think that's still the case?
I think that what we experienced during the COVID pandemic, the initial stage, and again, as you said, it kind of continues through, shifted the way that we define what connectedness and a sense of belonging means. We went from a lot of physical connection, whether it's youth who are engaging with each other in schools and classrooms, on the playground, sports, etc. During that period of time, we had a lot of disruptions to our ability to physically connect in those one-to-one or small group settings to where everyone kind of deviated to online. Long-term impact, I think we're probably going to continue to monitor that, but I do think there was a significant influential impact on our youth as well as our adults around their perceptions of where they feel connected, where they feel like they belong, what they identify with, what kind of motivates what helps make them feel successful, more capable of doing things. And we've seen some shifts in our social media platforms as well. If we walked away with something that was really helpful during the COVID pandemic, it was some of that shift in social media platforms that have now provided greater access to mental health services. And so now we see prompts for 988 or Colorado Crisis Services. And again, it still requires the user of that platform to navigate those mental health resources if it's needed in that time.
So it's safe to say that if used correctly, there are a lot of resources online through social media and community platforms, Reddit or Twitch, or however you find your way of connecting.
I am not an expert on all the different platforms that are out there, but I do think that there are access points for resources. Some are very helpful. So I referenced, for example, 988, the I Matter campaign, Colorado Crisis Services. If someone is using a particular platform or an online search engine and it's concerning, artificial intelligence might prompt the user of, if you're having thoughts of suicide, please consider reaching out to X, Y, and Z. But I can't say that there's consistency across every online platform. So you listed off about 5 or 6 different ones. Would depend on what's kind of informing the content on that platform and whether or not those are being provided as resources if what the individual is engaging in is concerning.
Well, with you mentioning that number, now sounds like a good time to say this, which is if you see something, say something. Yeah. There are sometimes signs, I would say, and it's important for us to take care of each other and look out for one another. And if you see someone that you're communicating with online or in person and there are signs, now is a good time to remind you, like, there are resources, there are ways to get some help.
Yes.
Dr. Lineman, I want to ask and kind of shift gears a little bit. So we've talked about how social media can be used, I would say, for positive things, right? Or a sense of community. But let's talk about the other side of that coin, right? How does cyberbullying or online harassment contribute to increased suicidal ideation among adolescents and young adults?
Yeah, bullying has long been identified as a risk factor for elevated risk associated with suicide. And we know that as our youth, our children start to move into kind of the online environment, that the risk kind of shifts a little bit and can present in different ways. So whether it's harassment, discrimination, racism, hate speech, anything that's perceived within kind of the umbrella of online bullying can really defeat an individual, can impact their self-esteem, their sense of self-worth, their self-efficacy, and really increase the risk associated with the feelings that you often experience whenever you're isolated, related to anxiety, depression, stress, overwhelm, which again is going to increase your risk for suicide.
Is there something that we can do about that, right? Is there something along the lines of, like, can we report cyberbullying? Can we report it to a school or a principal, perhaps? What can we do?
So children and youth who are experiencing some type of online harassment or bullying would be really important for them just to talk with their parent or their caregiver, let them know what's going on, really have an opportunity to open the conversation around how you're feeling, what you're experiencing. And it's really important to take the moment to remind that talking about suicide doesn't put the thought in your head, but rather opens the door for conversation. So while it might start as a conversation related to bullying, it could evolve into greater risk around sadness, depression, or potential risk of suicide. Disassociation. So just having the conversation really kind of opens it up. But I also would encourage parents, children, youth, so thinking about all the continuum, to also connect with people at school that are identified as trusted adults. They have different types of systems of response that can help navigate, inform, equip those who might be experiencing some type of online bullying. And then, of course, in Colorado, we have Safe to Tell Colorado, right? And going back to what you said, if you see something, say something. It takes a little time, takes a little attention, but also reminds us it's a community approach to really mitigate any type of risk associated with suicide. So again, you see something, say something.
Dr. Lineman, I want to ask, what role does the comparison culture on social media, likes, followers, the curated lifestyle, FOMO for the folks out there, play into shaping self-esteem and suicidal thoughts?
Yeah, that FOMO you referenced, that fear of missing out. Online social media platforms and technology is so sophisticated and so advanced, and it is only as intelligent as the lowest denominator of what's kind of being contributed into it, meaning that what you put into it is what you get out of it.
Sure.
And then you think about the individuals who engage in online platforms and kind of the role of how we're influencing each other. We see some of our young children and our youth very influenced by whether it's entertainers, pop stars, social media influencers. You go back 30 years ago, you and I, we had no concept of a social media influencer. Our children today want to be social media influencers.
Right.
And so the way that the artificial intelligence that kind of helps inform what those platforms do can really be responsive to what people are liking, what they're searching in their search engines. It's almost like online content says, this is what you want, let me give you more of it. And so depending on what more you're exposed to, and especially if it's something that can be triggering any type of violence, things where individuals are experiencing suicidal ideation, while sometimes it might help validate someone how they're feeling, and they'll go, ooh, it's not just me having these feelings, it can also increase their risk because it can be traumatic to be exposed to similar content like that.
Well, I think that's the whole purpose of social media, right? And the social media companies, which is to make sure that you are on the platform as long as possible. And I know that because of that, it's going to reward content that is more shareable, I would say, or content that's outrageous in either direction, right? And so it's important for us to understand that, and when we're monitoring our children's online presence, it's important to keep that in mind, right? We were talking with Grant Van Pelt before the show started, who's also a colleague of yours, I believe, and we were talking about the book, The Anxious Child, and why children are so anxious right now. And we talked about how in the book it makes the claim that if you can delay giving your child a phone until they're in high school, you save them a great deal of this what we're talking about today, right? And so you're able to keep them from becoming an anxious child and having that need for that dopamine hit in order, what you call doom scrolling, right? And so, and it's tough too, because obviously here at DPS, we manage our social media accounts, but our accounts, and we're aware of all this because as good marketers, as good communicators, we need to understand the algorithm and whatnot, but we want to make sure that the children are seeing successful things, right? It's one of my goals is to highlight success stories here in the district, because it says if they can do it and they look like me and they're from my school or from my community, I can too, right? And so this is kind of a few ways that I want to say, are contributing in a positive way to this social media situation, which leads me into my next question about algorithms. How do algorithms that recommend content and affect the visibility of suicide-related materials, how is that vulnerability affect our users?
Yeah, so going back to kind of that sophistication of technology, and again, I am not an expert in any type of coding associated with it, but we do know it is developed, as you said, to reinforce what it is that we might be seeking or what we want to see. I use myself as an example. I am too guilty of scrolling through certain social media platforms. I tend to gravitate towards animals and food.
Very cute.
Positive things, right? Yes. Our children are very similar. Whatever is interesting to them or kind of gives them that dopamine rush, as you indicated. Yeah. Every time you like it, every time you continue to watch a certain duration of time of a particular video or something that's been posted, that logarithm kind of cycles through and tailors to give you more of that. And so that's why it's so important to talk with our children and our youth around what's going on online, having conversations. And DPS, we talk about digital citizenship, which is just being a responsible consumer of any type of content. And I would extend that to what are you watching on television? Right. What are you watching on social media? Who are you associating with? What are you reading? And helping to make sure that you understand what's real, what's fictional, how it's influencing the decisions that contribute to who you are, how you identify, and what fills your bucket to make you feel successful, which can be challenging for individuals whose brains are not developed yet, who are still trying to look to adults and other type of influence content that's put out there to help shape who they identify as and really define their self-worth.
Going back to something that you said earlier in our conversation about how our children want to be influencers, right? When I was growing up, kiddos wanted to be YouTube stars, right? So it's very similar in the sense that we just want to be seen, we want to be heard, and we want to be respected. I think those are all part of hierarchical needs that we have inherently as human beings in order to feel like that we belong, right? The only problem here is in order to be an influencer, in order to be a YouTube star, I would say, is it takes a lot of work, right? As from looking at from the outside, it says, oh, we made a funny video and we made millions off of it. Well, I can do that, but it's about creating the content, but also at some point, ethical decision making comes into play, I would say. And that's where you see some of the influencers start to change what they're doing, right? They start to believe in something. And it all brings it back to us following and what type of content gets shown on our feed. And so the claim that I'm making here is the more you interact with, I would say, negative messaging out there, right? And we know what's good messaging and what's bad messaging, right? But do our kiddos know, right? Because if they find that entertaining, even though it's bad messaging, they're going to like it. They're going to share it, right? And that just continues this cycle and rewards it. And that's what the algorithm is about, is every time there's a like, every time there's a view, every time it gets shared, it amplifies it and it shares it with more and more people, because that's the goal for the platform, right? So that more eyeballs get into that. And so my question to you around social media is, to what extent can social media campaigns and awareness movements reduce the stigma and encourage help-seeking behavior around suicide?
So you just spoke a lot about social media and how sometimes it presents a lot of negative content, and sometimes that's motivated by money, likes, a sense of self-worth, identification. Similarly, any type of online campaign can also provide kind of a sense of self and really aims to combat any of those myths, that stigma that's associated with whatever the content is associated with the particular campaign. In the area of suicide prevention, they tend to promote, like, what are the risk factors, what are the warning signs, and how do you access support if you need it. Now, you'll hear the information sharing. So you're really building individuals' awareness, their knowledge of certain things, and hopefully prompting them to move into some skill-based development so that you're accessing whatever that support is. Hence, when social media platforms will pop up the 988 number or Safe to Tell Colorado or the Colorado Crisis Services, right? We're trying to give you the tools so that you can take some of that action. But media campaigns kind of fall short and further needs around anyone who might need a higher level of care. And so campaigns are great, right? They're good community, broad stroke approaches to really help increase that awareness and that knowledge. And there are going to be individuals who just need a little higher level of care, whether it's therapeutic services or some other support that you're not going to find through an online platform.
Well, the other issue too here is those campaigns are competing with everyone, right? I tell everyone here, because everyone always asks us, like, what are social media best practices? I was like, well, you either want to create something that's authentic, that informs or has an emotional connection to something, to the school, to the district, right? And so all of these campaigns, like you said, they fall short a bit because it might be one organization putting out one campaign, but you have dozens of influencers pushing out content every single day, and you're competing with that. And that can be tough.
You also, like when you talk about dozens of campaigns that are competing with each other, sometimes campaigns are also targeting a particular demographic or a specific population based on what they perceive as going to meet that particular group's needs. But when we're talking about online activity, anyone could be exposed to it, which is why sometimes you're going to find that level of response or that care needs to be more individualized, which again is going to speak to some of the shortfalls of online type of campaign awareness strategies.
So we've kind of been doing it ourselves here with this podcast, right? We've been talking about awareness because that's the whole point, right? We're talking about the good awareness, the bad awareness, right? Now let's talk about some solutions. So my next question for you is, how can families, educators, or anyone else in the mental health profession leverage social media positively to reduce suicide risk in at-risk populations?
Yeah, so I really believe in the human-to-human connection. So if, for example, you and I can meet, I can get to know you a little bit. As a trained professional, hopefully I'm going to lean in a little more around your areas of strength, things that make you have stronger self-efficacy, stronger self-esteem, right? And then alongside, we talk a little bit about digital citizenship and talk about values and things that can influence what you might be interested in learning more about or engaging in, and how sometimes that can, result in some positive outcomes and sometimes it doesn't. So in terms of solutions, I think opening that conversation, reinstilling the importance of a sense of connectedness and belonging, validating an individual's authenticity of how they show up and what they might need, and then helping to inform how do you become a responsible consumer of what might be out there. And that's not a conversation. That's an ongoing conversation. I would encourage my parents to be a little vulnerable in what their experiences have been. We did not all wake up with a cell phone and a social media platform.
We did not.
And that's okay. Our experiences were different, but it humanizes the experience that we had alongside listening and validating the experience of our children and our youth and helping to identify that if we don't have the answer, together we can help define what might be needed in terms of support to make sure that we are both safe, supported, and going back feeling connected, that we belong in a healthy way.
Just for reference for our audience, right? Right now you have Gen Z in high school, but you're starting to have the first year of the cohort of Gen Alpha in high school, right? And then the first Gen Beta kiddos were actually born this year. And so now we're starting in to get to different generations. It's about 15 to 25 years within the differences in generations. And so, and I say all of this to say Gen Z is the first generation that was born with cell phones in their hand, essentially, right?
Yeah.
Because, for example, for me, when I was growing up, we definitely didn't have cell phones. There were pagers, for sure.
Yeah.
But a cell phone wasn't widely used. And when I got my first cell phone, I was 11 years old, but it only could send a certain amount of text messages and only can make a certain amount of calls. And it had the little snake game where he ate the little pebble.
I remember that snake game.
and that was the gist of it, right? And so as far as connectivity, I wasn't really exposed to all that. And then in high school, such a trip now that I remember it, we had Walkmans, the CD Walkmans, freshman year, but by the time I graduated high school, in those 4 years, we had the invention of the iPhone. We had the introduction of Facebook. And so it was kind of like a rocket. And so a lot of my friends, they either jumped on this or didn't. And you can see, I have a lot of friends now, and you would think that they would be on Facebook or social media. They are not. And then I have a lot of friends who are religiously on it. And it just goes to show you the cohorts, the generations, and what we're into right now.
I can remember in college when I got my first email address.
Oh my goodness.
I know, it's been a long time. But I remember having that internal story, the story you tell yourself of, I'm never going to use this.
We always say that.
I don't need to pay attention to this. But I remember that experience every time technology has changed. Really questioning myself, is that something we need to invest in? Do we not? Is it going to be needed? I remember having my first Facebook account, opened it, closed it, didn't touch it for years, right? You speak about a 4-year 5-year time period, some of our families have had generational experiences around technology and may have more content of how to have that conversation, but I'm feeling pretty confident we probably have some who lack that content information, especially in older generations, whereas we're having to lean into our younger generations to help educate us and help inform us of like what is going on, what is out there. But if you come back to that conversation, the sharing of those experiences gives perspective, normalizes the experiences that we're having, validating the different feelings that we had as we kind of evolved and grew up and developed alongside technology, but still comes back to the appropriate consumerness of online content. Still comes back to values, still comes back to what makes you feel good versus what are good choices and what are choices that are not going to help you find success, which is why I say always comes back to the conversation. And through that conversation, you have a shared experience that is going to build that sense of connectedness, that belonging. So everyone's got a different story and a different experience, but it's the connection that I think is really going to help leverage, especially in the area of suicide prevention, because we know that is the strongest protective factor. So however we can open that dialogue, keep that conversation going as we experience whatever the world sends our way, because it's going to be different, right? Is really where prevention lies.
Since we talked last, AI was not very out there, I would say, but it's definitely out there now.
It is.
And we talked last, I want to say 9 months ago, less than a year.
Yeah.
Right? How has that affected, if at all, suicidal ideation, risk?
Yeah, definitely have been some things in the media of individuals and their experience with artificial intelligence. And again, I'm not an expert in artificial intelligence, but you are right. People are consuming it more often. I think it's going to be an area of technology growth that we're going to have to continue to watch to really see where that leads us. I question if individuals who are kind of seeing that impact around risk associated with suicide, if they're having the conversations, if they understand the technology that they're engaging in, I question like what is the intent of what might be putting into those different generators in terms of questions and what are we seeking and where else could we be seeking answers that might be more supportive, help more adaptive functioning and greater success in terms of overall wellness.
I was just last week listening to a podcast and they talked about how ChatGPT was being used by youth, and specifically with suicide prevention. And they talked about how it's important for families to monitor the interactions that they have with AI, because it's not simply for what normal society would use it for, like a second Google, I would say, right? That's kind of what we're using it now. But the younger generations are looking at it more as like a assistant, friend, colleague, right? And so they're asking them these serious questions. And there are safeguards for suicide prevention on AI, but as we get more sophisticated with it, the folks are finding ways around that. And so kind of the message here that I want to give to our families, and what are your thoughts, is monitor that as well.
Yeah, I think anything we're doing with technology, if we're seeking an answer, something that is informing our self-worth, the sense of self, how we identify, should always be monitored with intent of helping to learn, grow. I know that there's a lot of fear around children and youth that if my parents know where I'm at or what I'm looking on, they're going to take it away from me, restrict it. And I think if we can shift kind of that approach to better understanding it, using technology in a more responsible way, we together will find more success and potentially decrease any risk that's associated with suicide.
Dr. Lineman, this has been a real treat, and it's always a real treat when you come onto the show. I think that there are things that we can discuss every time that you come on. Today we discussed AI and social media. I want to ask, before we let you go, do you have a final message?
I think my final message is that, coming back to the umbrella of our conversation today, suicide prevention, it takes a community, it takes a village, it takes everyone to be in that conversation. Really educate yourself around, like, what are the risk factors, what are the warning signs, and how do you access support? Technology is one input that can help in both ways, as we've talked about today. There's so much more. So keep that conversation going. Reach out to someone in your school to ask about any type of training. Google a training, right? We're always looking for answers in different ways. And talk with a loved one around what it is that you know, what it is they might have in terms of questions, but keep the conversation going.
Dr. Lineman, I want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, friends and families, this concludes our EDUCA DPS podcast for today, and I want to thank our guest, Dr. Jane Lineman, for such an important conversation. I want to thank our DPS Communications Department and, of course, our Superintendent, Dr. Alex Marrero, for his consistent support to all of our multimedia productions, including the EDUCA DPS podcast. If you found this interesting or found this episode of value, please share this content with your friends and family. This is how we get the word out. This is the best way to help this information reach the right audience. You can find us on all the major podcast platforms under the DPS Podcast Network, and you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel at Denver Public Schools Plus. My name is Javier Ibarra. Until next time.